Hi, and welcome. I'm Justin Bath, and I'm going to talk a little bit in this module about the legal framework that underpins school law in Kentucky. So, to get us started on this journey, I think it is important for us to take a moment and think about what is law. It's this big concept we see a lot of. You see various representations of law in the media, but really, law is a large and complex thing that has lots and lots of layers. And we're going to look at the layers in this module a little bit more. So law is very much just this big overarching general term for all these different rules that we govern society with when we take the effort to formally write them down. There's lots of things that also govern society that we don't formally write down, and we put those in different frameworks, right? So I love this particular way of thinking about code in general. This comes from Lawrence Lessig at Harvard. We regulate society through markets and architectures and technologies. And of course, we regulate society through norms, all those things we don't write down that we still use to regulate society. But when we bother to write them down in various democratic ways, we consider that to be law. All right, so that's the stuff we're going to dive into in this particular class, all that law stuff. Other classes you might have or other modules you might watch might talk about markets and architectures and norms, and you have classes on like school discipline behavior. Okay, great. That's a class about norms and how do we have the appropriate and set the appropriate norms inside of a given classroom. But once a disciplinary event happens, well, we have policies to deal with that. Those policies are a form of law, and that's all the stuff we're going to deal with in this class. All right, great. So when we talk about law in the United States relative to education, we have to actually start with the U.S. Constitution, and not so much what's in the U.S. Constitution, but what's not in the U.S. Constitution. The concept of education is not mentioned in the Constitution, and so this particular amendment, the 10th Amendment, is a controlling amendment for us in education. It says that the power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by the states, are reserved to the states, respectively, or to the people. Just meaning that all the big topics that aren't covered in the U.S. Constitution fall to state governments, the 50 state governments. So really what this Constitution is saying is that we are going to govern the concept of education in the United States through 50 different countries. For purposes of this class, law and schools, we are dealing with 50 different countries, not one single United States. We're dealing with 50 separate states. And so this particular class is going to focus on Kentucky school law because Kentucky school law is different than Indiana school law or Utah school law. For this purpose, they are different countries. And so we'll address them as such throughout the remainder of the class. Now, of course, this building in Washington, it still likes to get involved in public education from time to time. Some of the big concepts, the big laws that you probably remember are the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. The No Child Left Behind Act got lots of public attention, but it was just an iteration of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act that went back to the 1970s, and now we call that exact same law that's been modified over time the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA. Now, these are federal laws, and we just got through reading the provision in the U.S. Constitution that says education is not mentioned, therefore it is a state's right. Well, the way that it works is the federal government does choose to involve itself in public education on a few matters, especially matters related to discrimination issues and poverty issues. On those issues, what it chooses to do is to provide money to the states in exchange for the states enacting the kinds of policies that the federal government wants to see. It, of course, does have the power to raise and spend money in the Commerce Clause of the United States Constitution, and so it uses that clause to regulate commerce and to provide for the general welfare with money, to provide states with money in exchange for certain educational policies. So that's how the federal government plays a role, but they play a quite limited role. In the school finance class that often accompanies this one, you'll see that the federal government has a quite limited role. Only around less than 10% of an average school's budget is coming from the federal government. most of the money that's coming to run a particular school is coming from the state. So let's turn there. So here in Kentucky, we have the Commonwealth's Constitution. Section 183 of our current Constitution, passed in the 1890s, says that the General Assembly shall, by appropriate legislation, provide for an efficient system of common schools throughout the state. Now, that particular provision has been subject to multiple lawsuits, one of which changed Kentuckian education as you know it, and it's in the modules if you're reading along. The Rose versus Council for Better Education decision laid out the foundational interpretation of what the word efficient means in this particular provision. Okay, so since this provision came into existence, we have been providing by appropriate legislation the system of schools in Kentucky. And look who it gives the power to. It does not give the power to local school boards. It does not give the power to local superintendents. It gives the power to regulate and run schools to the General Assembly. So when it comes to how do we run our schools in Kentucky, at the root of that is the Kentucky General Assembly in this building in Frankfort. The General Assembly has sort of ultimate control over Kentucky's schools, right? And so they also issue statutes. Those statutes then get codified into our school laws. Those school laws sort of run the schools of Kentucky. Now, if you are looking at the school laws, here's a copy from 1910, the Common School Laws of Kentucky, and a more recent copy. It hasn't changed all that much, but it's gotten fatter and fatter and fatter over time, to the point that the versions of the Kentucky school laws recently are run for thousands of pages. There's that much law that is governing Kentucky schools on a given day. And everything that is foundational to what we think of as school pretty much lives in that book, the Kentucky School Laws. For instance, how many days should there be of school? Well, there's a law about that. How many minutes do we need to go to school? There's a law about that. Who can be a teacher? There's a law about that. What does it take to be a principal? There's a law about that. Okay, so all of that lives in Kentucky schools laws. Now, as expansive as that document is, and it's massive, it still doesn't cover everything that it takes to run Kentucky schools. The General Assembly provides the school laws in this broad format, but then there's lots of room for interpretation, and that is the job of the Kentucky Department of Education to provide meat on the bones of those big, broad laws that get provided by the General Assembly. The Department of Education, now in this building in Frankfort, their job is to provide all of the detail that goes with the big laws to actually run the schools. All right, so you get things like, this is the Kentucky Administrative Regulations published by the Educational Professional Standards Board, which is a regulatory board. That regulatory board is authorized in statute, but it lives underneath the governor. And so the governor gets to appoint the people that sit on this board, and then this board approves regulations as part of their job. Each one of those lines that you see there is a different regulation regulating teacher certification in Kentucky. And these regulations, they provide all the detail around the big laws in order to run our states. Okay, great. But now you are going to work at a school in all likelihood, right? And so your interaction with Frankfort is minimal. So you have all these laws coming down from Frankfort, and they pass down to local school districts. Local school districts then have layers of law themselves, right? So in any given school district, you have school board policy. School boards are authorized to publish their own policies, but really those policies are laws for purposes of that geographic zone that they're serving. And then inside each school, at each school site, there is another layer of law that exists. Here in Kentucky, we have site-based decision-making, and so the SBDM policies at each local school also have legal effect, right? So when you see a document like this, the Highland Aviators SBDM bylaws and policies for Highland Elementary, that has the force of law for that school, right? So we're dealing with law all the way from the U.S. Constitution, all the way down to Highland Elementary SBDM policies. All law. We have to keep all that in mind. A lot of it is the legislative in nature, some of it is executive in nature, but all of that law that's being written down in advance forms the massive sort of governing regulation of how we run our schools. Okay, great. Then it gets inside of your classroom, dear teachers. You're standing in these classrooms with these kids and you're making tons of decisions on a daily basis. Or if you're the principal, you're in these buildings, you're making tons of decisions on a daily basis. Your decisions have the force of law. Remember, you work for the General Assembly. You are a state employee. The General Assembly runs the schools. The local school boards operate those schools. So you're employed by a local school board, but really you are a Kentucky state employee. Of course, the Kentucky state government offers you your pension, for instance. So you have the force of law in your own decision making. And when it comes to the kid, when you ask the kid who makes the law, I don't think they're going to think about the folks in Washington or the folks in Frankfurt or even the local school board. They're going to think about principals and teachers, the people that they see in their buildings on a daily basis. You, for them, really are the lawmakers, because your decision to suspend or not suspend a kid, or your decision to offer makeup work on a given assignment, all of those are policies. All of those are legal decisions. They can be challenged in court. You're making those decisions in real time. So really, to them, you are the law, and the vast majority of school law is being made on a given day inside of classrooms, inside of schools, by our employees. So great. Welcome to the Lawmaking Club. Now, look, there is a branch of government I've not yet talked about that we do need to talk about in this particular course. Remember, there are three branches of government: the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. The judicial doesn't really write down their law in advance. The rules around the judicial branch require us to look at what's happening in real time. And we see courthouses all over Kentucky. These are the three courthouses that sit in downtown Lexington: our local trial court, our appellate court for this region of Kentucky, and our U.S. Federal District Court. There's a lot of courthouses just in one block because there's a lot of law that needs sort of interpretation. Because as much as we write down in advance, and we write down a ton of law in advance, we can't write down everything, and a given fact pattern, a given scenario emerges, and we have to apply the law and interpret the laws relative to a given case. And it is in those cases that we rely on the judicial system to help us make rulings about the law in real time. Okay, so it plays an enormous role. And believe it or not, most of what constitutes our knowledge around law is coming from the court system, the corpus. All these decisions add up over time to really provide us a deep, rich understanding of what the law is on a given subject, like student First Amendment rights or something. Okay, great. Inside those buildings are folks like this. This is the Kentucky Supreme Court, a lawyer arguing to the Kentucky Supreme Court. This all happens in Frankfurt, and we have cases that flow through these bodies. For instance, in 1990, this group of people, the Kentucky Supreme Court, invalidated the entire educational system in the Rose versus Council for Better Education case. The legislature responded quickly, rebuilding the system through the Kentucky Education Reform Act, which does a whole bunch of things that you're going to talk a little bit more about in your finance class, like equalizing the various spending levels between districts. Those judges play a huge role in our legal system. We're going to talk a lot about and even look at some of the rulings that they issue here in this class. Now, just because there's the Supreme Court, don't forget the courts of appeals and the local circuit and district courts. These are all things that are happening down in your local level. The interaction you're likely to have with a given court is going to be down there in green at the circuit court level, just with your local county courthouse. The Court of Appeals are regionally distributed. There's one in Lexington, one in Louisville, and several throughout the state. And then if they survive that level, they keep going up all the way up to the Supreme Court. All right. It is with all of that law that we govern these buildings, these schools. And if you're looking to be a teacher in these schools, if you're looking to be a principal of one of these schools, you have to have a sense of this deep foundation of law that it takes to run these buildings on a given day. It's in this class where we're going to really dive into all that, but throughout all of our work in this class, please keep the legal framework in mind. Who's making this ruling? What kind of law is being issued here? That kind of law, what kind of effect does it have? Do I have to follow this as binding precedent, or is this something I'm just interpreting from somewhere else? All of that is weighing in on your decision making inside of these buildings on a given day. And we're going to try to, in this class, give you a broad foundation and try to help you make the right decisions. Thanks.